In recent years, there have been charges from time to time that the CIA has involved itself in illegal activities. Some of the most bizarre to date involve a bank in Australia known as Nugan Hand. And tonight, Gary Shepard has a report.
When the Nugan Hand Bank of Sydney, Australia collapsed in 1980, it appeared at first glance to be just another bank failure. But after Australian authorities began taking a closer look, they discovered a tangled web of intrigue with all the elements of a best-selling spy novel: a mysterious death, the body later dug up from its grave, illegal currency transactions, big-time drug operations, and the Central Intelligence Agency.
We were to become the paymasters for the CIA around the world. In other words, we were putting ourselves in the position to disperse funds for the CIA to whoever they were directed.
Former bank executive Neil Evans, given immunity from prosecution, agreed to talk about the Nugan Hand operation on Australian television. From his account and others, the bank had its genesis during the Vietnam War. 4 of the original stockholders were Americans who listed their addresses as Air America, Army Post Office, San Francisco. Air America was the CIA airline in Indochina, hauling men and supplies on clandestine missions. And according to former CIA agents, even drugs out of the so-called Golden Triangle, where the borders of Burma, Laos, and Thailand converge. Nugan Hand sent Neil Evans to the Thai city of Chiang Mai, the commercial center of the drug trade. He claims the CIA made millions and used the money to finance some of its secret projects.
The idea was that money would be deposited with the Nugan Hand Bank by the CIA through various channels, and also that the Nugan Hand Bank would be the repository for funds coming in from various CIA enterprises, namely drugs in Thailand, and that the Nugan Hand Bank would then be responsible for rerouting that money to an account in America with a New York bank.
Nugan Hand was not your ordinary bank. There were secret numbered accounts, and hardly any of its top people were bankers. Many were American civilians and former high-ranking military officers with ties to U.S. intelligence. When they found the body of Australian businessman Frank Nugan, the bank's chairman, shot to death a few months before the bank went under, they discovered in his pocket the business card of this man, William Colby, former director of the CIA. Nugan's partner was Michael Hand, an American Green Beret who served 2 tours in Vietnam, one of them for the Central Intelligence Agency. He disappeared a short while after the bank collapsed. Australian newspapers reported a connection between Nugan Hand and the U.S. Navy's super-secret intelligence unit known as Task Force 157. Among its top agents, CIA man Edwin Wilson, now under indictment for selling arms and explosives to Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And a man named Patry Loomis has also been implicated. He was the apparent CIA Nugan Hand go-between. It was Loomis who helped Wilson recruit a team of Green Berets to train terrorists in Libya. The Nugan Hand affair has caused an uproar in Australia, where authorities are trying to find out what involvement the bank might have had in the 1975 downfall of the Labour Party government. Meanwhile, investigators on 3 continents are attempting to trace $50 million missing from the accounts of depositors, including many Americans. Here in this country, the CIA denies any involvement with drug operations in Indochina, the Nugan Hand Bank itself, or the death of the men who ran it. Gary Shepard, CBS News, Los Angeles.
And that's the news.
Before we go further into this, Colonel Prouty, your information is so important.
The job I had of supporting the CIA for 9 years in the Pentagon. Well, for instance, I knew Alan Dulles personally. I had worked in his home with him. And the whole Vietnam area was just covered with drugs. And I'll tell you a little incident perhaps I've never even heard about. A bank opened called the Nugan Hand Bank.
Oh, yes.
Was a man named Michael Hand, who was a CIA man. I used to know Michael quite well. This bank was formed because he has so much money, they couldn't get it home.
So it was a money laundering bank.
When you bring these things up, they're matter of fact when you work with them. I mean, I work with these people day by day. You begin to see what was really going on as against the things you read in the papers.
And the truth, again, I must bring you to this, Colonel Prouty. Many of those drugs, a great amount of it was given to our U.S. troops.
Oh, of course.
Now, can you tell us why the inside power would want to sicken our men there in Vietnam to the point that they did by, taking them to a place they had no business being in the first place. What are your thoughts on that, on this terrible tragedy and shame?
Well, you have to answer in a perfectly honest way. The heroin business is one of the biggest money-making businesses in the world, and they were making billions of dollars. Nugan Hand Bank was worth more than $1 billion by the time it disappeared, when Frank Nugan was killed.
The Nugan Hand Bank you mentioned, that's an interesting thing. They needed a bank to keep money for CIA, and it had to have a legitimate reason for being. So they used a young man that was with the agency that used to be in and out of our office, Lansdale's office and my office in the Pentagon, named Michael Hand. Then he joined up with a man from Australia, and his name was Frank Nugan. Well, their bank all of a sudden shot up to being worth about $1 billion, and in those days that was a big bank. And many of the directors of the bank around the world, that had global offices around the world, were retired admirals and generals of the military service. Well, one day they found Frank Nugan dead in his car in the countryside in Australia. It was supposed to have been a suicide, but it happened under very unusual conditions, and physically it would have been impossible for the man to fire the weapon he did and hit himself in the place it hit. But anyway, the Australians, they never solved it yet. From that day on, we never saw Michael Hand again, and he was full-time CIA man. I have heard from mutual friends that he's alive and well and prospering. Much of the money in there was what you might call phony money anyway. I mean, money that would be very hard to trace. All I know about it is I worked with the Australians for a while because they got tangled up with the paperwork. At their request, I worked with them. The best way to say it is they just never found the money.
There were people whom I know, I could identify one of them to you clearly, who made so much money in illegal transactions in Indochina during the war, from the sale of drugs, from gold, from money exchange, from things like that, who worked with the Chinese, who worked even with the mafia, that they can't come home. A man that used to work in the office with Lansdale and myself when we worked for the Secretary of Defense merged his interests with a man in Australia to create the Nugan Hand Bank. Nugan died, supposedly a suicide. Hand had never been located by the Australian government, but Hand is alive. Now, the $1 billion disappeared. I don't know how much of the $1 billion he may have kept. Maybe 25 cents, maybe the whole billion. He's an MIA, you see, and he can't come home because of his status. Well, there's an awful lot of men who made millions and millions of dollars in the Indochina War, and by choice or other reason, they cannot come home. And if they do, they can't identify themselves. Now, whether the families know that or not, that's another matter.